Hi folks, we're just giving a few moments here at the top for Zoom to let everybody in before we get started. If you are already in tonight's webinar with us, you can open up your chat window and find some information about how to purchase books by tonight's featured authors. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Eddie S. Glaude Jr. presenting the paperback edition of his book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. He'll be talking with Robert Jones Jr., so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Eddie, Robert, and the team at Crown for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. Now, just a few housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Begin Again, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, noon to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Eddie's book and many others on site. Or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop that buy link in the chat. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Robert Jones Jr. He's a writer from New York City. He received his BFA in creative writing and MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College. He has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, Essence, and the Paris Review. He's the creator and curator of the social justice social media community Son of Baldwin, which has over 275,000 members across platforms. Prophets is his debut novel. He'll be speaking with our featured author, Eddie S. Glaude Jr. He is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. He is the former president of the American Academy of Religion, the largest professional organization of scholars of religion in the world. Glaude is the author of several important books, including Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, which has been described as one of the most imaginative, daring books of the 21st century. He's a columnist for Time magazine and an MSNBC contributor on programs like Morning Joe and Deadline White House with Nicole Wallace. He also regularly appears on Meet the Press on Sundays. His prize-winning book, Begin Again, is one of the great books on James Baldwin, and a powerful reckoning with America's ongoing failure to confront the lies it tells itself about race. The book has been praised by such celebrated fellow writers as Edwidge Danticat, Keith Lemon, Tracy K. Smith, Walter Isaacson, and Imani Perry, who says Begin Again is an unparalleled masterpiece of social criticism. Glaude thinks alongside America's finest essayist, matching the master's firepower, brilliance, courage, and sensitivity at every turn. This book is precisely the witness we need for our treacherous times. Dr. Glaude is going to be talking with Robert and then with all of you. Eddie and Robert, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. And thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Dr. Glaude. I would like to start by giving a land acknowledgement to the Lenape and Canarsie peoples upon whose land I live. And I also want to give a shout out to the spirit of our ancestors and those who are gone too soon. Black Lives Matter. Dr. Glaude, thank you so much for writing this book. First question I want to ask is, what made you decide to revisit Baldwin in this way? His writings, his messages, his worldview, and why do you think it was necessary at this particular moment?
First of all, let me just say, I'm so excited to be in conversation with you, to just meet you. I wish we were together. We're both in the midst of what seems to be a developing storm, which is so indicative of our times, yes. I want to thank Greenlight, thank Chelsea for her gracious introduction, and I'm looking forward to the dialogue with everyone tonight. Why Baldwin? Why? You know, in some ways I was in despair. I was saying to myself, they've done it again. You know, all of those young people who had risked so much in Black Lives with Black Lives Matter, many of whom were dying in Ferguson. And we couldn't give an account of how and why. Some were saying suicide, but there were questions.
Right.
And the response of the nation was to elect this man, to unleash this ugliness. The ghosts were haunting in full view. And I knew that Baldwin had written in a time of betrayal, right? The late Baldwin had been so important to my understanding. I've been obsessed with No Name in the Street for years. And so I said, hey, like you, I wanted to go into the wreckage and the ruins and find resources to help me say something about the moment. So I knew Jimmy had experienced despair, even though he told the story that, you know, the writer never despairs. He was not telling the truth. But so I knew that there were resources there to help me to help me pick up the pieces so that I could say something meaningful, or at least try to say something meaningful to the moment in which we happen to find ourselves. Yeah.
And this work is so vital. I read it with bated breath, and I was so moved, not simply by what you excavated about Baldwin, but the means in which, the lens through which you observed all of it and the analysis that you brought forth. There's this continuing theme in Begin Again where you talk about the lie. And can you tell us what the lie is?
Oh yeah, because we're experiencing it right now, right? So this lie, the lie is this, Baldwin wrote about it in 1964 in The White Problem. He made it explicit. And I'll paraphrase him here. He says, you know, the Christians who founded the nation had a fatal flaw. They thought they were coming to found a democracy, but they had these chattel, and they had to reconcile the role of these chattel in their lives. And so they said that these men and women were not, in fact, men and women. Because if they were not human beings, then no crime would have been committed. And then Baldwin says that lie is the basis of our present trouble. So the lie is this kind of general account of America as this shining city on the hill, as this example of democracy achieved, this broad architecture that allows the country to maintain its innocence in relation to what it has done and what it continues to do. And it also involves blaming us for our condition. So the reason were slaves or denied the burdens of citizenship is that we lack the capacity to hold, to exercise citizenship. We were animalistic, we were lustful, we were sinful, full of vice and the like, or we can't save money, or we're prone to criminality, or, we can go down. So there's this broad discourse that displaces, right, this idea of white supremacy onto the backs of those who have to bear the brunt of it.
Right.
And it allows for the country to distort and disfigure the truth when it confronts it, because it always has to, the lie works as this kind of efficient mechanism to protect American innocence. So yeah, I think Jimmy was very clear about that being at the core of the project, it seems to me. Yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the few voices who could articulate it in the way in which he articulated it, that brought it down to its bare bones. Begin Again raises several conundrums. As I was reading through it, I was like, oh, these are some really deep philosophical problems that we have to confront. One of them was made me ask this question. What do you think compels the white liberal to ask us to focus so intently on and attend to the grievances of those white people committed to bigotry? Even after the insurrection at the nation's capital made their nihilism plain, there seems to be a commitment to them that suggests that their grievances, which politicians mask behind a multitude of excuses to avoid calling it what it is, it makes these grievances seem to have merit. What are Black people to do under those sorts of circumstances?
Such a great question, Robert. So my answer has been, right, that we only have a finite amount of civic energy. And we should no longer spend our time trying to convince those who hold insidious views about who we are, that they ought not to hold those views, that we should spend our time trying to build a new Jerusalem.
Mm.
That's what I think. That's my response, that we don't need to tend to them, coddle them in this way. But I think the question, though, cuts to the heart of how the country has always dealt with this. You can go back to de Tocqueville, or you can go back to Jefferson's notes. So in Jefferson's notes, when he's talking about the sentence where he talks about he's afraid of the retribution that will follow for the evil of slavery, it's in a chapter about habit formation. What happens to the child who witnesses the brutality of a beating in the context of slavery? Mm. And so Jefferson, even in this moment, isn't really concerned about Black people. He's concerned more directly with the soul of white people. Mm-hmm. That slavery disfigures them. Right. So they're not concerned with us. And de Tocqueville, even in the Three Races chapter in Democracy in America, he talks about slavery having deleterious effects on the character of the slaveholder. Yeah. That it's not about us, you see. So we are kind of in this, to use Edward Said's language, oftentimes we're outside the sphere of their moral concern. Mm. And if we are, it's typically as objects of charity or philanthropic activity. So they're concerned about, the grievance of the Trump voter because they're concerned about them. Mm. Right? And that's it is, and that's evidence, it seems to me, in their literature, and going all the way back to the founding.
You will get no argument from me. That is absolutely the case, I believe. There's also another concept you discuss in beginning.
Sure.
And it was one of the wonderful things about this book are the ways in which you name these concepts so that we can have this working understanding of them. This other concept of elsewhere.
Yeah.
Please talk to us about that.
So, that chapter almost wasn't written
Really?
because what I wanted to do was to go to Istanbul.
Okay.
I was going to follow Jimmy's tracks.
Okay.
I was going to go over there with my good friend Carol Weinstein. Carol and I have since had some arguments, but we were going to go over there and we were going to travel, and I was going to go to all of Jimmy's haunts. And someone said to me, this was before Khashoggi was murdered over there, and they were like, "Man, you criticized Trump, and you're going to go to Erdogan's Istanbul. You need to be careful." And then the State Department issued its warnings and the like. So my editor then said, well, why don't you just interview some activists? And I said, we're always extracting from activists. Can I write something for them? Right. And so this elsewhere emerged, out of my reading of Baldwin in Tahrir Square, in Taksim Square, I think, in Another Place, right? When he's sitting there looking out and he turns around and his brow is furrowed, and then suddenly this big tooth smile emerges, right?
Yeah.
And I said, you need this space where you can laugh full belly laughs, where you can cuss at the top of your lungs, where you can, when you need to be around people who love you, not because you're James Baldwin or Eddie Glaude, but because you're Bebe. This is my nickname, right?
Okay.
When your knees buckle, they got you.
Right.
So, and elsewhere is this space that allows you to get the requisite distance so that you can re-enter the fray. So Baldwin leaves in 48, goes to Paris. He gets that distance. Istanbul provides him some distance after King is murdered. And he's not, Istanbul is that place between the East and the West. He's not quite famous yet because the play hasn't been put on yet. And so he has a level of I wouldn't say anonymity, but he has space to try to catch his breath. And we all need elsewheres, right? To get the distance so that we can replenish. We need elsewheres where people love us in spite of ourselves. We need elsewheres to get the distance requisite from the powers that be, because the temptations of the bribe are always there. So you need to be able to extract yourself so that you don't wind up making some bad decisions and bad choices, you see.
Have mercy. I just want to take a moment to let our viewers know, the attendees know, that if you have questions for Dr. Glaude, please put them in the Q&A box down at the bottom. That's those dialogue boxes down at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Thank you. Again, with the concepts that for me encapsulate things that are sometimes hard to do, hard to encapsulate, that is the aftertime.
Yeah.
Oh, and all of this feels very spiritual to me, by the way. So talk to us about the aftertime.
Well, I get the phrase from Walt Whitman's 1871 treatise, Democratic Vistas. And Whitman is trying to make sense of the world that is emerging in the aftermath of the carnage of the Civil War. And he uses this formulation. I was just looking at it the other day. The hollowness at heart, the hollowness of the heart, because greed is rampaging. And so the aftertimes is this moment, this interregnum between a world that is collapsing and a world that's trying to come into being, and something is happening that's displacing the idealization, right? It's that what Robert Johnson would call that crossroads.
Yes.
That crossroads, you see. So I need to be, there's the storm. We just had a blink of the lights. Let's hope we can stay on, right? Yes. So the aftertimes is that period when a world is dying and a world is trying to come into being, but we've closed the door, right, on the possibility of shifting, of changing, right? So Baldwin was writing in that moment when the country had turned its back on the promise of the Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century. The nation's answer to the assassination of Dr. King was to elect Richard Nixon twice, was the Hard Hat Rebellion, was the riots around school busing in Boston, was the election of Ronald Reagan. And for many people many people don't understand that for those who are part of Black Power, Reagan was as notorious as George Wallace. And so for the country to elect him was a backhand to the lip, to the mouth, was a backhand to the face, you see. So the after times marks this period where there is a sense in which the country is on the cusp of change. A door is shut, a world is collapsing, a world that's trying to come into being is being choked to death.
Mercy.
You see, and this is the moment we happen to find ourselves in.
It seems like we continually find ourselves in that moment. As you outlined, Nixon and then Reagan and then the Bushes, it's just like constantly, every time we think that there is a possibility of a window opening, a door is shut right in our faces. It is a tragedy. In 67, and you point this out in Begin Again, Baldwin said, "I would like us to do something unprecedented, to create ourselves without finding it necessary to create an enemy." You say white people make Black identity politics necessary, but if we are to survive, we cannot get trapped there.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate? What is the risk if we do become trapped there, and what exactly is the trap?
Oh my God. You know, Baldwin, this is the thread that you can see it from Many Thousands Gone all the way to everything, the evidence of things not seen. Right? The categories are those that box us in, that limit the expansiveness of human endeavor, right? In a world that's organized around color, in a world where the value gap obtains, that is the belief that white people matter more, it only makes sense that in order to resist in kind of an internal agreement with the way that world is organized, that we would recoup a notion of Blackness and claim it as beautiful and the like. But Baldwin would then say, but you can't get caught up in this mystical Black bullshit, right? Because in that moment, you flatten the complexity of who we are. That's like, how does he respond to Richard Wright's Bigger Thomas? If that's all we are is a tangled web of social pathologies, then I can't account for you, Richard.
Right.
So he wants to keep track of the material conditions of Black life, but he also wants to keep track of the complex interiority of Black life. Oh, I'm getting into prophets here, aren't I? Right? The complexity of desire, right? The way in which you queer colonial desire in the context of empty, yes? Right? Yeah. And so the point that I want to make here is that if we begin to think of representation, our Blackness, as the definitive feature of who we are, then we've sprung the trap again. Because now we're going to lose sight of class positions. We're going to lose sight of sexuality. We're going to lose sight of gender. We're going to lose sight of religious or non-religious. We're going to lose sight of the complexity of who we are, you see. And because what happens is that we end up being permanently docked in the station, fixed, as it were. And this is why Baldwin is constantly resisting these categories that try to fix it. You know, when they try to just label him this or that, you can see him just moving in different directions, it seems to me.
Would you say these labels, these boxes, these categories are not our creation, that we've adopted them as almost something that sprung out of nature, but they're actually constructed by the colonial powers, and that we've taken them on and used them for self-definition in a way that might be detrimental?
Well, we enter a world that is not in part of our making. You see, we're socialized into a world where there are languages that circulate, that allow us to see the world in particular sorts of ways. Look at this, and everybody's protest now. I got it near me. He says, now as then, we find ourselves bound, first without, then within, by the nature of our categorization. And escape is not effected through a bitter railing against this trap. It is though this very striving were the only motion needed to spring the trap upon us. We take our shape, it is true, within and against that cage of reality bequeathed us at our birth, and yet it is precisely through our dependence on this reality that we are most endlessly betrayed. So he's working through this dialectic, right? You enter into a world where there are these languages, these assumptions about who we are that try to fix us. Then if we try to rail against it, we're stuck. This is Du Bois, right? In the beginning of Souls of Black Folk, right? You start railing, you just caught within that. But then if you embrace the language too much, then you're trapped again, you see.
Yeah.
So how do we find the means to think of ourselves in the most expansive of ways? And for Baldwin, as I read him, the poet, the artist, helps us do this, right?
Morrison too makes that same point, that this is the job of the artist, to imagine something better and greater than what we have now. And speaking of activists and artists, Ella Baker, ancestor Ella Baker, once said, "We cannot be free in America or anywhere else where there is capitalism and imperialism." What are your thoughts on the idea, and this might delve a little bit into some Afro-pessimism, that there is no reforming of the United States to be had, that the US was created as and exists as an immutable anti-Black state, and anti-Blackness is the essential DNA that makes up what the USA is, that as long as Black people are here, as long as Blackness itself is defined through the mechanisms of whiteness and its creation of particular ideas about race, Black people will suffer irrespective of whatever social, economic, cultural, legal, or symbolic gains occur.
Intuitively, I reject that. Right? I don't want to see, to me, America is an argument more than an idea. And what I mean by that is that there's some folks who have been making an argument counter to that description that make us possible. It's like that moment at the end of Nothing Personal, right? It's an elegy for, this is the essay that accompanies Richard Avedon's amazing photographs. It's an elegy to Medgar Evers in part, but the way it ends with this appeal to love and generations of family and connection, right? It's my great grandmama on the coast of Mississippi. I remember when I came back from Morehouse, I was this rabid Black nationalist, and this woman who had spent her life working in white folks' houses on the coast of Mississippi, Robert, said to me, I don't know what's going on with you, but you need to stop. White folks ain't gonna change. The Afro-pessimist insight. But then she says, but if you keep dwelling on that, that shit'll eat you up. And then she walked on.
Yes.
Then she moved on. So remember, he says, Baldwin, if you rail against the trap, if you rail against it, you're caught, because you spend all of your time right there, stuck. So part of what I believe, reading Baldwin, I believe in the New Jerusalem. I believe in our capacity, even though we're disasters, right, to do miracles.
Baldwin. That's no name in the street right there.
I believe. And so the Afro-pessimist has to make either one or two moves. They have to become either Afro-futurists. They have to jump out of the world, reach for Sam Delaney or Octavia Butler or something, right? They have to jump out of the world, or they have the language to justify taking the bribe.
Mm,
The world is what it is. I might as well get mine.
have mercy. That one is the scary one. That option there is the scary option. That we just become our oppressors. Like Baldwin, I think it was Baldwin that said that our railing against it just simply assures them of their power. So we have to imagine something different. And so, yes, that right there is the answer. One of the things about Begin Again that I love so much is that you weave so many different aspects of Baldwin's life under this critical lens, but also this loving lens, including his sexuality, his masculinity, and such. You write that Eldridge Cleaver had already judged Baldwin and found his masculinity wanting. I found this interesting because Cleaver's idea of masculinity was not only frightening, but it was wholly that of the slave master, which is to say white. And yet, Baldwin was also committed to a particular kind of patriarchal masculinity, likely because he wanted to prove that his queerness didn't make him less of a man.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of these embodiments of strength and violence? And why are they such attractive features to so many people? This kind of patriarchal masculinity. And that's so much so that Baldwin even had to take sort of defend that idea. I'm thinking about his conversations with Nikki Giovanni or Audre Lorde.
Yeah. You know, I think this is where the book fails. You know, I didn't know how to grapple with this within the context of the narrative structure that I had to invent in order to do what I was doing. So the book is this kind of combination of biography, literary criticism, and social criticism. And so I made a decision not to sit here. So there were these gestures at the very point that you're making, but I don't sustain it across. And so I think it's one of the failures of the book. Sometimes it's, you know, the short answer to your question is that this is the access to power, right? This is the pathway to inhabit power, right? To leave behind a certain kind of powerlessness, to inhabit a certain kind of patriarchal stance, right? A certain kind of masculinist stance, right? And you see this in that moment when Nikki Giovanni, which was so liberating for me as a writer, because Baldwin was killing me. You know, he was demanding so much of me that my world was collapsing.
Mercy.
You know, because he's constantly asking you to be honest and to engage in this self-reflection, you know, and I'm sitting here saying, well, the scaffolding that I've built, I'm deconstructing, and then Nikki Giovanni says, lie to me. And Baldwin is confused.
Yeah, he was utterly confused.
I can't lie to you. No, she said, lie to me. And then you realize that if sometimes for the folks that you love, you gotta tell lies. You know, you can't be all the time directly honest, you know, in certain sorts of ways. So I think in that moment, his affinity with conceding to the frame was exposed. Also in the exchange with Audre Lorde, as you mentioned. But then I was talking with this Imani Perry about this, because when you read Freaks, when you read Male Prison, it's clear that he understands what you just said.
When you read Here Be Dragons.
Oh, absolutely.
When you read Evidence of Things Not Seen, he breaks down that he understands what these issues are. So he eventually comes to it. Maybe
but rhetorically,
yes.
But rhetorically, though, so Male Prisons is early. Here Be Dragons is late, right? So, but every time he's speaking in public, what he does is he starts inhabiting, right, these traditional frameworks about men who don't have jobs, and as a way of accounting perhaps for the stepfather, right, or his father, because we think about the kind of harsh criticism of the father right? The stepfather at the beginning of the corpus, and the way in which that reading of his father, of David Baldwin Sr., how it becomes more generous by the end, that he's almost trying to give an account of his failures. But we know he understands exactly what you're saying.
It's almost sometimes when you see him, you know, like that famous what was it whose show he was on, where he says, and you want me to make some active faith, risking my woman, my children. You can tell.
Yeah.
Have it, yes. You can tell that it's almost like he feels like he's representing something greater than him, not just himself. So he's speaking on behalf of. And maybe that is where, you know, you get this, because even when he's talking to Audre Lorde, he's saying, you have to understand men are going to be men. Even if he himself understands the problematics there, he is expressing, I guess, the group dynamic to Audre Lorde, who then says, well, then you're going to get bashed in the head.
Exactly.
But yeah, speaking of like his later works, like Evidence of Things Not Seen and Here Be Dragons, many of Baldwin's critics have expressed how they felt that his literary and artistic powers waned in his later years. The New York Times recently published an article called When James Baldwin Was a Has-Been. But I find that his post The Fire Next Time work seems to be some of his most truthful, powerful, and compelling. The Devil Finds Work, The Price of the Ticket, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, chief among them. What do you think accounts for this shift where white liberals and even Black critics begin to view Baldwin in this way?
The 80s, the latter part of the 70s and the 80s. You think about the decade of the 80s. This is the ascendance of the Black middle class. This is the age of the Cosby Show, and Baldwin is still bringing the fire. It's almost as if people didn't want to hear. As he said to Quincy Troop, I felt like a broken engine saying the same thing over and over again. You can only go to Texas so many times. Or the way in which you think about Evidence of Things Not Seen, and those babies being murdered in Atlanta, and those murders happened about a few years before I got to Morehouse. I got to Morehouse in 85. Mm-hmm. And so Baldwin is trying to ask the question, what happens when white supremacy still obtains and we hold the reins of power? So Evidence of Things Not Seen is a kind of preface to that moment when Obama is on screen calling folks thugs, and you have the Black mayor and the Black sheriff of Baltimore, and Black folk are in the streets, in Baltimore, right? Baldwin is trying to account for, and this kind of account puts him in, he's always misfitted, right? It puts him at a kind of queer angle to the aspirations of Black elites. So I think, what he told those young Howard students in 1963, that I will never betray you. He lived to his last breath.
His last breath.
To his last breath. And so I think the judgment of his later work is more about them, is more about the critic than it is about him.
I agree with that.
Now, mind you, I think there's some moments where you can say, okay, the Johnny Walker Black might have got a bit too much, or he's not editing like he used to. Okay. You can see that in the evidence, but there's some formulations in the Evidence of Things Not Seen that are just so cold that you just got to just close the book and just walk around the house.
Right. Exactly.
So yeah.
You talk about him foreseeing the Barack Obama moment. He actually, directly addresses the idea of a Black president, and he says, I'm not concerned with that. I'm concerned with what kind of country he would be president of. And so, see, that's the thing that people are like, what more do you want? Is kind of like the frustration you hear out of Baldwin's critics, is what more do you want? Which is what we hear as Black people. What more do you want? You hear from a lot of even the white liberals. The thing I appreciate most about Begin Again is the way in which it succeeds in making Baldwin a human being, a person, from his feelings of ugliness and unworthiness to his multiple suicide attempts. We rarely get to see Baldwin or any Black man or any Black person for that matter as vulnerable. And I really saw him as a vulnerable human being in this. Why do you think it was important for you to include these aspects of Baldwin's life in this work?
Oh, wow. Because it's absolutely essential to saying anything about the world. Baldwin holds the view, as I read it, that the messiness of the world is actually a reflection of the messiness of our interior lives. That the ugliness of our social arrangements is actually a reflection of the ugliness that's in us. So he, when he goes to the South, he said, these people, they're lying to themselves. These folk, these people. So for me, I remember when I was writing the book, Robert, that the sentences weren't initially dancing. I've said this before in other interviews, right? The sentences weren't dancing. And I remember hearing Jimmy's voice. And I call him Jimmy because he's a walking partner for me.
Yes.
He says, well, old boy, if we're going to do this together, old boy, well, you're going to have to deal with you.
Mm.
And what did that mean for me? That meant that I had to deal with the fact that I'm a wounded little boy with daddy issues. That I look just like my father, who scared the shit out of me.
Ooh, have mercy.
And Baldwin is grappling with the primordial wound, right? Of not only feeling ugly and feeling unloved, but being misfitted. And you can see that he was the object of such violence, right? When those papers are no longer embargoed, we're going to see much more of the life that was his, right? When you read To Crush a Serpent or these essays, you can see what was happening to this little boy in Greenwich.
Mercy.
Right? So there is a sense in which the vulnerability is absolutely necessary for a certain kind of maturity. If you can't accept, see, this is the key. If you can't accept who you are, what you are, how you've become who you are, you cannot step in who you can be.
Mm.
The same thing holds for the nation, Doc. So the vulnerability is absolutely necessary to render, because it is the sign of maturity on the horizon. You see?
Yes.
If that makes sense. Does that make sense? You tell me, because you've been reading.
That makes 100%. I love this conversation because there's not a lot of questions that I really had reading this book, because I really got answers. And that's what I appreciate so much about your work, is I got a ton of answers. There is something that I do want to ponder, though. Can we talk about the notion that Baldwin survived what he endured? Because is there an argument to be made that it just took them a little bit longer to destroy him? Because I'm thinking about this man who died of a very painful death. He died of cancer in a little cottage in another country with just a few people around him, in a semi-state of hallucination. He sees his mother's face on the wall and wondering if they'll find him in the wreckage, because he's thinking that he's going to be forgotten after all he had given, and how he had never, as you said, betrayed us. And for me, Baldwin was gone too soon. So did he really survive, or did it just take them longer to destroy him?
It might be both and,
Okay.
Because there is no doubt that there's survivor's guilt, right? Because, his fate was not that of Medgar or Malcolm or Martin's. It wasn't that of Emmett's or all those unknown bodies that line the bottom of the Mississippi River. So that, and you see him in the latter part of his life trying to render what it means to have survived that.
Mm.
He's not bunchy, he's not, and so there's that. But then there's the too much drink,
The smoking.
the smoking,
There was
the sense of loneliness.
there was a sense of despair because there was self-harm, whether
Right.
it was obvious or surreptitious, it was there. And I never thought about survivor's guilt until you just brought that up, that it might have been they took them, why am I still here? I never considered that.
And when you look at the FBI files on it, people thought he was paranoid, but he had every reason to be. And then to see where the country was going. That line and that answer to Quincy True. I don't care who says what, I watched it happen. I know because I watched it happen. And all this because they want to be white. And why do they want to be white? Because it's the only way to justify the slaughter.
Oh, God.
They're trapped. Come on, man. And this is on his deathbed. He's dead 2 months. He's dead in 2 months.
In 2 months. In 2 months. Oh, I have more questions. But
Sure. Yeah, let's keep going.
I
know we have something.
Yes, I want to give our guests the opportunity to ask their questions. So I'm going to go into the Q&A. And just to remind you, folks, if you have questions for Dr. Glaude, please put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. From Lisa Barr, Dr. Glaude, you are so needed right now. I'm an MFA 2022 candidate, and I'm including Baldwin and your book, of course, in my thesis, which looks at our literary elders, the OGs and the IGs, the new writing generation. What do you hope the new writing generation like Robert and myself, if I'm so bold, would or should write about? How can we create a literary footprint like Baldwin for future generations?
Tell the truth. Tell the truth. Tap the root. That wonderful piece he wrote entitled "As Much Truth as One Can Bear."
As much truth as one can bear.
Right, and he says the novelist, right, to be a great novelist, one has to tell the truth and then a little more.
Mm.
So you have to tap the root of the human endeavor. Give without imitation, right? Give a kind of attention to the full complexity of our doings and sufferings in the world. Right. That's the beauty of it. When I read, for example, Jessamine Ward's Sing Unburied Sing, right? And it is a book that I talk about all the time because it's in the tradition. You can feel its connection, but it is wholly contemporary. It is ours. Its references are ours. Its rhythm, its pitch, it's familiar to me. Yeah. And to people who are younger than me, right? But she's getting at something, right? Tapping the root. So, I don't want you to be like Baldwin. I want you to just simply get at this, what we're trying to do between these two breaths, these two momentous breaths, the first one and the last one. What we're trying to do and how you as the poet can render in a certain sort of way, So, when we think about Samuel and Isaiah and what they're doing, right? How those characters are working. So tap the root. That's all I could say. Tap the root.
No pressure. No pressure. Our next question is from Susan Littman. The Republicans seem hell-bent on not recognizing Black people as equal in the United States, especially now with their attacks on denying equal voting rights. How do you see this reconciled this decade?
I don't. That's the thing. I'm not sure. You know, we're in that cycle where choices have to be made. And, you know, when Tim Scott, right after Joe Biden gave his speech to the joint session, he was charged by Republicans to respond. And the first thing he said was, America, one of the first things he said is, America is not a racist country. And then Kamala Harris came behind him and said the same thing, but said we have to deal with our history. Now, we could argue about whether or not the claim is true, but that's not the interesting part. The interesting question is, why did he make the claim?
Right.
Because they were trying to arrest our efforts to fundamentally transform the society. So we're in the midst right now in real time of the reassertion of the lie. And so the question for us is, what choices will be made? I said on Morning Joe and Deadline White House the other day, I said, you know, the question isn't to me, it's up to you. The loud races are who they are. But the question is, what are you gonna do? Right? And so the question is what the majority of white America, how they are going to respond to this third of the country that once again has expressed its refusal to believe that all men and women are created equal. Will they stand silently by again as they choke the life out of American democracy? That's the question. So I'm not sure it will be resolved this decade. Let me say this really quickly. I'm from the Gulf Coast. I'm from a small town on the Gulf Coast, Moss Point, Mississippi. And I know a little bit about hurricanes. You know, the front end of a hurricane is really violent. And then you got the eye of the storm. And the eye of the storm allows you to come in. It's kind of calm. It allows you to come outside and assess the damage. But you can't be lulled to sleep because the tail is coming. Mm. The tail is just as violent as the front end. We still have the tail coming, y'all. The tail is still coming.
We have a question from Brendan Winfrey. Later in his life, Baldwin once said in a speech, "It will be confessed. It must be confessed. There is no refuge from confession but suicide. And suicide is a confession. And that is where we are. Now but where the Western world is, I expect nothing from them. I finally expect everything from us." Brendan asks, I wonder if you could explain this.
One way in which I try to parse it is the shift in Baldwin's we. Right? Early Baldwin, he's saying to his nephew that we have to love these people into a different understanding of themselves. It's the kind of inversion of the white man's burden. They become our burden in some ways, right? Mm-hmm. But then I think there's this sense, some people say you see it as early as Blues for Mr. Charlie. I want to say that it's consolidated after the assassination of Dr. King. That it's not, we can't spend our energy expecting them to change. Those who are invested in this idea that white people ought to be valued more than others. We cannot spend our time trying to convince them otherwise. We must do the work. Mm. We must do the work. It is on us. And that us is not just simply Black folk. That us is a broad swath of human beings of various backgrounds willing to risk everything to bring about a new world, a new Jerusalem, if that makes sense.
The relatively conscious Blacks, the relatively conscious
Blacks, who like lovers.
Who like lovers.
And what he means by that is that we're vulnerable together, right? Right. We're risking, it's like standing before someone, with no clothes on, and they can see all of your blemishes, all of your faults, and like lovers, right? In that sense, so yeah.
We have a question from Dante Stewart.
Oh, Dante, I know Dante.
Do you know Dante? This young brother who shouting in the fire is coming soon. I have the chance to have an early copy of it. I got to blurb it. This brother is amazing, and I'm so glad that he's in here today.
Indeed.
He asks, many scholars make the case that though Baldwin left the church never left him. If that's true, which I believe it is, how can Baldwin help us imagine a better faith, hope, and love than the many ways in which white Christianity and Black Christianity often fail us?
Dante, as usual, you get into the heart of the matter, brother. I think it's all found in To Crush a Serpent. That essay, ironically published in Playboy magazine, that essay, right, offers an account of salvation and love that is just off the chart. You see, I'm constantly reaching for books, y'all. Right. But he says, salvation is not flight from the wrath of God. It is accepting and reciprocating the love of God. Salvation is not separation. It is the beginning of union with all that is or has been or will ever be. There is absolutely no salvation without love. This is the will in the middle of the will. Salvation does not divide. Salvation connects so that one sees oneself in others and others in oneself. It is not the exclusive property of any dogma, creed, or church. It keeps the channel open between oneself and however one wishes to name that which is greater than oneself. It has absolutely nothing to do with one's fortunes or one's circumstances in one's passage through this world. It is a mighty fortress, even in the teeth of ruin or at the gates of death. It protects one from nothing except one thing. One will never curse God or man.
Hallelujah.
That's Jimmy's theology, kind of in a nutshell, Dante. Yeah, that's it right there.
Hallelujah.
Yeah, my man. Indeed. I'll put it up later. Yeah.
We have two more questions.
Sure.
Another from Lisa Barr. What do you think Baldwin would write today if he was still alive?
Lisa, I wouldn't even dare try to answer that question. You know, to be honest with you, I think he would still be bearing witness in the way in which he was prone to do. I don't know what kind of. Could you imagine the novels that he would be writing?
Mercy.
But I wouldn't even dare try to approximate what. I know that he would still be pursuing some of the truths that he was pursuing in 1948 in this current moment. Yeah.
And he would have reason, because it's kind of like we're on a loop. So yeah. We have one last question in the chat, and it is from Susan Littman again. The results of the Civil War have not been accepted. Is another civil war necessary? It would appear that Republicans believe this, but Democrats don't. Why?
So we're in a cold civil war now. Many on the Republican side are clear about their commitments. The irony is that there's some on the Democratic side who aren't willing to make clear their own commitments.
Well,
you see, that's the key. And so there are those who are content with the order of things. They're content with tinkering around the edges, but they do not want to fundamentally transform American life. And many of them call themselves Democrats. So, yeah, so, you know, that's what Jimmy was so skeptical of white liberals. He says, I'm skeptical of people who want to do something for me as opposed to with me.
As long as you think you're white, there is no hope for you, is what Baldwin said.
And the way in which I render that, Robert, is that there's nothing redeemable about the idea of white America.
Idea of whiteness.
There's nothing redeemable, but that doesn't mean that we are irredeemable.
Correct. Because the person is not the thing. There it is. What a perfect note to end this conversation on. I really hate that this conversation is ending because I have, as you can see, a ton more questions for you, brother. But our hour is up. Dr. Glaude, thank you so very much for this offering, for this testimony and this witnessing, for raising up Ancestor Baldwin in this way, for speaking with us today here, giving us so much to learn, to listen to witness ourselves. You are full of wisdom, and we are thankful for you, truly.
I'm blessed to have this opportunity. And when I see you, I'm giving you a big hug. That's if you let me.
Yes, by all means, by all means.
Indeed. I appreciate it. Everybody stay safe, okay? Take care. Chelsea, you good?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Glaude and Robert, for this excellent conversation. I think Robert said it all. And thank all of you for coming out tonight and spending this time with us. A reminder that you can buy Begin Again from Greenlight Bookstore. If you're local to us here in Brooklyn, we're open noon to 7 every day for limited capacity browsing, and you can pick up a copy of the book in our stores. Or I've dropped the buy link in the chat, and you can buy online at greenlightbookstore.com for quick in-store pickup or for shipping anywhere within the US. And you can also buy Robert's excellent debut novel, The Prophets, from Greenlight Bookstore and on greenlightbookstore.com. Thank you all so much again, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.